So once again, click on resubmit and the text box will open up, type in 3 significant things from today, and we'll just be looking at international leaders. There are some autocrats or individual people that have absolute control left in the world. They're extremely rare, but they still exist, and probably one of the best examples would be the King of Saudi Arabia, who exercises complete control over society, influencing religion, the government itself, and the military, and also the economy. So he is an absolute ruler. This used to be a lot more common, doesn't exist for the most part in the world today, but in a couple places it still does. And so it is possible to have autocrats. It's also possible to have a dictator seize control, usually through the military. And this occasionally does happen. Egypt has had a history of this in the past, within the past couple decades, of a president being elected, but maybe being too radical when it comes to religion, for instance. So the military will take over and basically place one of their higher ranking generals in charge. So that occasionally happens as well. In much of the world, the people who used to be kings or queens or some other position are now just heads of state. And so there are kings and queens throughout the world. Europe still actually has quite a few still. Japan has an emperor, but most of these are just figureheads. They basically serve the role that the President of the United States does when it comes to meeting and greeting foreign dignitaries, holding fancy ceremonies and dinner parties, talking to ambassadors, things like that, and maybe even making speeches on behalf of the entire country. But if they do, like when the Queen, it's called the Queen's speech, and every year she gives one before Parliament, and then when Parliament opens, excuse me, and then also at Christmas time. But that is usually prepared or proofread by the government, so they don't have a lot of freedom in what they say because they can't overrule the people that were actually put in charge. But most of the world either uses one of two systems. One is called the parliamentary system. That's what Britain has, Germany, Italy, most European countries, Japan, Australia, Canada. And when they have a parliamentary system, most of the power is placed within the legislative branch, which then chooses the executive branch. So the two are kind of merged together. They don't have a separation of powers like the United States does. Just to use the United Kingdom as an example, since they're one of the more significant ones in the world, they have a parliament, and it is bicameral. It has two parts, and the most important part is the House of Commons. The House of Commons is elected just like the House of Representatives is in the United States. Each of them represents a district, and both parties there, the major ones, the Conservative Party and the Labor Party, attempt to get a majority. And whoever gets a majority, their party leader is then chosen to be the prime minister, who is going to be the head of government. And other significant party members will make up the cabinet. So the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Agriculture, similar to our secretaries here, and they get to run the government. So Boris Johnson, who is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, he's not just the head of government, he's also representing his own little district back in his hometown. So these two branches basically are merged one and the same. And that's true in other countries as well, except they do a little bit differently. In Germany, for instance, when they have elections, you don't just necessarily vote for a person, you vote for a party. So if you vote for the Christian Democratic Party and they get 60% of the vote, then they get 60% of the seats. It's called a proportional election. So you end up voting for parties, and that encourages people to vote for smaller parties instead. So the Green Party, if it gets 7% of the vote in the United States, they would end up losing. But since they do it by percentages in Germany, they would get 7% of the seats. And you have to get over a certain amount. 5% is a threshold, so they don't get crazy smaller parties in there. But basically, whoever has the most seats then chooses the chancellor, which is what they call prime minister in Germany, who's currently Angela Merkel. So those are different types of parliamentary systems that exist, and that's how most power is exercised. The legislative chooses one of its own to be the executive. The rest of the world uses a similar system to the United States, a presidential system. Latin America, Africa, and it's often been called one of the worst exports ever from the United States, because even though it works here, in the rest of the world it often doesn't. The president often, especially since they're commander-in-chief in other countries, dominates society, Especially if they don't have term limits, they become incredibly corrupt. There's often cases of bribery and graft, which is establishing government projects that benefits their own families. And we've seen this happen again and again in Latin America and Africa. Now, it's been better over the last 10 or 20 years, but obviously there's still problems. And it's often thought that most of these countries would be better off with a parliamentary system. One of the other countries where it does work in particular, where it has over the last few decades, would be France. And technically, the president doesn't have a lot of power there, but he's the one that gets to choose the prime minister. And so, since he does, obviously, the prime minister is going to do whatever the president says. So, that kind of distribution of power helps stop one particular person from becoming too corrupt. But as for the rest of the world, the presidential system doesn't always work out that well, unless, of course, the society gets some kind of cultural value of very much anti-corruption and pro-ethics. And occasionally that is possible. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, they've all kind of fixed that system. And so they've been able to have more competent presidents and a less corrupt system over the last 10 or so years. Does anybody have any questions about any of that? None? All right. So go ahead and submit those three